The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Kensington Palace as Prince William adjusted his navy blazer one final time. His hands trembled slightly, something that rarely happened to the future king, but today was different. Today marked exactly 10 years since his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II, had passed away, leaving behind not just a legacy, but a secret that had remained locked away in her private study. William had received the ornate golden key from his father, King Charles III, just 3 days prior. Charles had handed it to him with tears in his eyes, explaining that the Queen had left specific instructions. The key was to be given to William on this exact date, with strict orders that he alone should open what lay behind the mahogany door of her most private chamber. Kate walked beside him, her emerald dress flowing gracefully as they made their way through the palace corridors. She could sense her husband's nervousness, though he tried to hide it behind his usual composed demeanor. The Princess of Wales had learned to read William's moods over their many years together, and she knew that whatever waited behind that door was weighing heavily on his mind. "Are you certain you want me there?" Kate asked softly, her voice echoing slightly in the grand hallway lined with portraits of generations of royals who had walked these same paths. William stopped walking and turned to face his wife. His blue eyes, so much like his late mother Diana's, reflected a mixture of determination and uncertainty. "Grandmother specifically mentioned in her letter that you should be present. She wrote that this concerned not just me, but our entire family's future." The couple continued their journey through the palace, passing servants who bowed respectfully but seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. Even the usually bustling atmosphere of the royal residence felt hushed, as if the very walls understood the significance of what was about to unfold. As they reached the familiar corridor leading to the Queen's former private quarters, William's pace slowed. He had walked this path countless times throughout his life, visiting his grandmother for tea, private conversations, and royal duties. But never had the distance seemed so long, nor had his footsteps felt so heavy. Kate reached out and gently took her husband's free hand, the one not clutching the antique key. Her touch provided the comfort and strength that had supported him through so many challenges over the years. She squeezed his fingers reassuringly, a silent promise that whatever they discovered together, they would face it as they always had, united. The door to Queen Elizabeth's private study stood before them, unchanged since her passing. The brass nameplate still gleamed, and the familiar scent of lavender and old books seemed to drift from beneath the heavy wooden barrier. William had expected this moment to feel ceremonial, perhaps even peaceful, but instead his heart raced with anticipation and a growing sense of unease. He inserted the key into the lock, surprised by how smoothly it turned after all these years. The mechanism clicked with a sound that seemed to echo through time itself, as if unlocking not just a room, but decades of carefully guarded royal secrets. William's hand rested on the ornate door handle, hesitating for just a moment longer. Kate stood close beside him, her presence both comforting and grounding. She had always been his anchor in moments of uncertainty, and today proved no different. Her steady breathing and calm demeanor helped slow his racing pulse, though she too felt the weight of whatever revelation awaited them. "Together," William whispered more to himself than to Kate, and slowly began to turn the handle. The door opened with a soft creak, revealing the dimly lit interior of a room that had remained sealed and untouched since the Queen's final days. Dust particles danced in the thin beam of light that entered from the hallway, creating an almost magical atmosphere. The study looked exactly as Queen Elizabeth had left it, with papers still arranged on her desk, reading glasses folded beside, an unfinished letter and her favorite fountain pen resting where she had last placed it. But it was what stood in the center of the room, covered by an elegant white silk cloth that immediately captured their attention. William stepped into the room first, his eyes adjusting to the soft lighting that filtered through the heavy curtains. Kate followed closely behind, her hand still linked with his, both of them moving with the reverence appropriate for entering what felt like a sacred space. The covered object in the room's center was roughly the size of a person, draped carefully in what appeared to be the finest silk. A small envelope lay on top, addressed in the Queen's distinctive handwriting. For William and Catherine, with all my love and trust in your discretion. With trembling fingers, William picked up the envelope and carefully opened it. Inside, written in his grandmother's familiar script, were words that would change everything he thought he knew about his family's history. The letter was brief but profound, explaining that what lay beneath the silk covering was a gift of truth, one that the Queen had protected throughout her entire reign. As William read the letter aloud to Kate, his voice began to shake. The Queen had written about a promise she had made long ago, about a secret that had shaped the monarchy's decisions for decades, and about her belief that William and Kate were the ones who could finally bring this truth to light. The weight of his grandmother's trust settled heavily on William's shoulders. He looked at Kate, seeing his own mix of curiosity and apprehension reflected in her eyes. Whatever lay beneath that silk covering, whatever truth the Queen had protected for so long, was about to become their responsibility to bear and to decide what to do with. William folded the letter carefully and placed it in his jacket pocket. The moment of revelation was at hand, and there was no turning back. He reached toward the silk covering, his fingers brushing against the smooth fabric that had concealed this mystery for so long. William's fingers hesitated at the edge of the silk cloth, the fabric cool and smooth beneath his touch. The letter from his grandmother had prepared him for something significant, but nothing could have truly readied him for what was about to be revealed. Kate moved closer, her shoulder touching his, providing silent support as they stood together in the hushed sanctuary of the Queen's private study. With one fluid motion, William pulled away the silk covering. What emerged from beneath the pristine fabric caused both of them to gasp in unison, their breath catching in their throats as they stared at the most extraordinary sight either had ever witnessed within the walls of any royal residence. Before them stood a life-sized oil painting, but not just any painting. It was a masterpiece that depicted Princess Diana in stunning detail, painted in a style that seemed to make her presence almost tangible in the dimly lit room. But what made this portrait truly remarkable wasn't just the incredible artistry, or the way Diana's eyes seemed to follow them with maternal warmth. It was what surrounded her in the painting. Diana was shown holding two infants, one in each arm, both babies appearing to be the same age. William recognized himself immediately in one of the children, the same blonde hair and blue eyes he had possessed as a baby. But the second child, identical in every way except for a small birthmark on the left shoulder, was someone he had never seen before. Kate's hand flew to her mouth as she studied the painting more closely. "William," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the sacred silence of the room. "There are two of you." The realization hit William like a physical blow. His legs felt unsteady as he stared at the impossible image before him. The painting was dated just weeks after his birth, signed by an artist whose name he didn't recognize but whose skill was undeniably masterful. Every detail was perfect, from the way Diana's dress fell around her as she cradled both children, to the loving expression on her face as she gazed down at both babies. Behind the main painting, William noticed something else, a smaller canvas, also covered. With hands that shook more violently now, he removed this second covering. This painting showed the same scene but from a different angle and included additional figures. King Charles, younger and with more hair, stood beside Diana, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder. But most shocking of all, Queen Elizabeth herself was in this second painting, holding what appeared to be official documents and wearing an expression of deep sadness. Kate sank into the Queen's leather chair, her mind struggling to process what they were seeing. "Is this why she wanted us both here?" she asked, looking up at her husband who stood frozen before the paintings. "Did your grandmother know you would need support for this?" William couldn't speak. His entire understanding of his own identity, his family, and his place in the royal lineage was crumbling around him. He had always wondered why certain childhood memories seemed fragmented, why there were periods of his early life that remained mysteriously unclear despite his usually excellent recall. Moving closer to examine the paintings in greater detail, William noticed something else that made his Hart stopped completely. In the corner of the larger painting, almost hidden in the shadows, was a small placard with text written in his grandmother's handwriting. William Arthur Philip Lewis and William James Philip Lewis, born September 15, 1982, separated September 20th, 1982. The date was 5 days after his official birth date. 5 days that had apparently been erased from royal history. 5 days that contained a secret so profound that the Queen of England had kept it hidden for over 4 decades. Kate rose from the chair and joined William in front of the paintings. She studied every detail, her trained eye taking in the artist's incredible attention to accuracy. The way Diana's hands held both children suggested she had actually posed for this painting, that these weren't imagined scenes but captured moments of real events that had been systematically removed from all official records. "There's more," William said suddenly, his voice hoarse with emotion. He had noticed a small wooden box sitting on the shelf behind where the paintings had been displayed. The box was ornate, made of what appeared to be mahogany inlaid with gold, and bore the royal coat of arms. Inside the box they discovered what could only be described as a parallel life, documented in photographs, medical records, and official documents that had never seen the light of day. There were birth certificates, 2 of them identical except for the names, hospital bracelets tiny and faded with age, and most heartbreaking of all, photographs of Diana feeding 2 babies, playing with 2 toddlers, and reading bedtime stories to 2 identical little boys. The medical records revealed the truth that had been buried for so long. William had been born as part of identical twins, but complications during birth had required the second child to be taken to a separate hospital for specialized care. During those crucial 5 days, a decision had been made that would alter the course of royal history forever. Kate picked up a document that appeared to be in Charles's handwriting, dated just days after the birth. It was a letter, never sent, expressing his anguish over the impossible choice that had been presented to the royal family. The second child, William's identical twin, had survived the birth complications, but had been born with a minor physical disability that in 1982, the royal advisors believed would make him unsuitable as a potential heir to the throne. The letter detailed Charles's internal struggle between his love for both his sons and the pressures of royal tradition and expectation. It spoke of sleepless nights, of Diana's tears, and of the Queen's ultimate decision that would ensure the monarchy's stability while breaking a mother's heart. William sank to his knees before the box of revelations, photographs spilling from his trembling hands. In image after image he saw himself as a child, but always with another child who looked exactly like him. Birthday parties with 2 cakes, Christmas mornings with 2 sets of identical presents, family vacations where Diana's attention was divided between 2 sons who shared not just her love, but identical faces. The final document in the box was, perhaps the most devastating of all. It was an adoption certificate, official and sealed, showing that William's twin brother had been placed with a loving family outside the royal circle. The adoptive parents had been sworn to secrecy, their identities protected by the highest levels of government security, and the child had grown up knowing nothing of his true heritage. Kate knelt beside her husband, gathering the scattered photographs, and holding them up to the light filtering through the study's windows. In each image she could see the unmistakable evidence of a secret that had consumed Queen Elizabeth's conscience for decades, a burden of truth that she had carried until her final breath, and a responsibility that she was now passing to the next generation of royals who would have to decide what to do with this earth-shattering revelation. The silence in Queen Elizabeth's private study stretched for what felt like hours, though only minutes had passed since the devastating discovery. William remained kneeling on the Persian carpet, surrounded by photographs that rewrote his entire childhood, while Kate sat cross-legged beside him, carefully examining each document as if looking for some explanation that might make this revelation less earth-shattering. Finally, William spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's someone out there who has my face, my genetics, my birthright, and he doesn't even know who he really is." The weight of this realization seemed to physically pain him as he pressed his palms against his temples, trying to process the magnitude of what they had uncovered. Kate reached for a photograph that had caught her attention, It showed Diana, sitting in what appeared to be a hospital room, cradling both babies while tears streamed down her face. The raw emotion captured in that moment spoke volumes about the impossible situation the royal family had faced over 40 years ago. "Look at this," Kate said softly, holding up another document she had found at the bottom of the wooden box. It was a medical report, detailed and clinical, explaining the circumstances that had led to the separation. William's twin brother had been born with a condition called clubfoot, a treatable disability that would have required surgery and physical therapy, but would not have significantly impacted his quality of life. The report went on to detail how palace advisors had met in emergency session, debating whether a future king could ascend to the throne with any physical imperfection, no matter how minor or correctable. The decision had ultimately come down to maintaining the traditional image of royal perfection, a choice that had torn the royal family apart behind closed doors while maintaining their composed public facade. William stood up slowly, his legs still unsteady, and walked to the window overlooking the palace gardens, the same gardens where he had played as a child, where he had learned to ride his bicycle, where he had spent countless hours with his grandmother learning about duty, service, and the weight of royal responsibility. All of those memories now felt different, tinged with the knowledge that somewhere else his identical twin had been experiencing a completely different childhood. "The Queen kept all of this," Kate observed, still sifting through the contents of the box. "Every photograph, every document, every piece of evidence. She never forgot him." Among the papers, she found what appeared to be reports, filed annually, detailing the progress and well-being of the adopted child. The Queen had been monitoring his life from a distance, ensuring his safety and happiness while never making contact. These reports painted the picture of a young man who had grown up in a loving middle-class family in the countryside. He had excelled in school, shown a natural aptitude for languages and history, and had even served in the military, choices that eerily mirrored William's own path through life. The most recent report, dated just months before the Queen's death, showed a successful man in his 40s, married with children of his own, working as a teacher, and completely unaware of the royal blood flowing through his veins. William turned, back to face the paintings of his mother, his eyes now seeing them with completely different understanding. "She knew," he said, studying Diana's expression in the portraits. "She knew this secret would eventually come to light. That's why she had these painted, evidence that couldn't be disputed or explained away." Kate found one more item in the box that made her gasp audibly. It was a letter addressed to William, but written in Diana's handwriting and dated just weeks before her death in 1997. The envelope was sealed with wax bearing Diana's personal seal, and had obviously never been opened. With trembling hands, William broke the seal and unfolded the letter. Diana's familiar handwriting filled 2 pages with words that had been waiting over 25 years to be read. In the letter, Diana expressed her deep regret about the decision that had been made when the boys were born, her daily heartache over the son she had been forced to give up, and her hope that someday, when William was old enough and strong enough, he would find a way to reunite with his twin brother. Diana wrote about watching William grow up, seeing traits and mannerisms that reminded her constantly of his missing twin. She described dreams where both her sons were together, playing and laughing as brothers should. Most powerfully, she wrote about her belief that the 2 boys, even separated, shared a connection that distance and time could never break. The letter concluded with Diana's blessing for whatever decision William would make about this secret, but also included a warning. She had learned that others knew about the twins' existence, people who might someday use this information for their own purposes. She urged William to be careful about who he trusted with this knowledge, and to remember that his brother's safety and privacy should be the primary concern in any decision about revealing the truth. Kate wiped away tears as William finished reading the letter aloud. The room felt heavy with the weight of decades of hidden pain, royal duty conflicting with parental love, and the impossible choices that had shaped their family's destiny. They both understood that they now held a secret that could shake the very foundations of the British monarchy. William carefully refolded his mother's letter and placed it back in the box with all the other evidence of his hidden family history. "What are we supposed to do with this?" he asked. looking at Kate with eyes that held a mixture of determination and fear. Do we try to find him? Do we tell the world? Do we protect him from ever knowing the truth? Kate stood and moved to her husband's side, taking his hands in hers. Your grandmother trusted us with this decision for a reason, she said gently. She could have taken this secret to her grave, but instead, she chose to give us the choice. That means she believed we would make the right decision, whatever that might be. They spent the next hour carefully examining every piece of evidence, memorizing details and trying to understand the full scope of what they had discovered. The most recent report about William's twin included a current address, photographs of his family, and details about his daily life that made him seem both foreign and familiar at the same time. As the afternoon sun began to slant through the study windows, William made a decision that would change everything. He carefully selected one photograph from the collection, a picture of him and his twin brother as toddlers, playing together in what appeared to be a private moment captured by Diana's camera. In the photo, both boys were laughing, their identical faces bright with joy, completely unaware of the separation that would soon divide their lives forever. I have to see him, William said finally, his voice filled with quiet determination. I need to know if he's happy, if he's safe, if there's any part of him that feels like something has been missing from his life. But I also need to be prepared for the possibility that learning the truth might destroy the life he's built for himself. Kate nodded, understanding the weight of what her husband was contemplating. They were about to embark on a journey that could reunite a family, expose a decades-old royal secret, and potentially change the course of British history forever. 3 weeks after the shocking discovery in Queen Elizabeth's private study, William found himself sitting in the back seat of an unmarked car, traveling through the English countryside toward a small village called Millbrook. Kate sat beside him, both of them dressed in casual clothing that would help them blend in with the local population. The weight of what they were about to do, approaching a man who had no idea he was the identical twin brother of the future, King of England, made every mile of the journey feel both too long and too short. The private investigators William had discreetly hired had confirmed the details from the Queen's reports. James William Thompson, aged 41, lived in a modest cottage with his wife Sarah and their 2 young children. He worked as a history teacher at the local secondary school and was beloved by both his students and the community. According to the investigators, he was known for his keen interest in British history, though he seemed to have no particular fascination with the royal family beyond academic curiosity. William studied the recent photographs of his twin brother as the car wound through narrow country lanes lined with hedgerows and stone walls. The resemblance was still unmistakable, even after 4 decades of living completely different lives. James had the same strong jawline, the same eyes, even the same way of tilting his head slightly when he smiled, a mannerism William recognized from looking at himself in mirrors throughout his life. Are you certain about this approach? Kate asked quietly as they neared their destination. They had debated for weeks about how to handle this first contact. Should they reveal everything immediately? Should they pretend to be researchers or journalists? In the end, they had decided on a version of the truth. They would introduce themselves as people researching historical connections between families and the royal household, hoping to gauge James's reaction before deciding how much to reveal. Triui, village of Millbrook, was picture perfect, with thatched cottages, a small church with a Norman tower, and a pub called the Crown and Anchor, where locals gathered for their weekly quiz nights. According to their research, James often stopped at the pub on Friday evenings after finishing his marking, usually ordering a pint of bitter and chatting with the landlord about current events or local history. It was a Friday afternoon when their car pulled up outside the village school. Through the windows, they could see students packing up their books and heading home, their voices carrying across the playground as they called goodbyes to friends and teachers. William's heart raced as he spotted a familiar figure standing in the doorway of the main building, waving farewell to departing students. James Thompson stood exactly as tall as William, with the same posture and the same unconscious way of running his hand through his hair when he was thinking. Even from a distance, the resemblance was so striking that Kate reached over and squeezed William's hand, both of them overwhelmed by the surreal nature of seeing William's identical twin living a completely ordinary life in this peaceful village. "He looks happy," Kate observed softly, watching as James laughed with a colleague before turning to go back inside the school building. "Look at the way he interacts with everyone. So natural and comfortable. He belongs here." They waited until the school day had completely ended before approaching. William had rehearsed what he would say dozens of times during the drive, but now, standing outside the building where his twin brother taught history to teenagers, his prepared words seemed inadequate for the magnitude of what he was about to set in motion. James was in his classroom, marking essays at a desk covered with books about medieval England and the Tudor dynasty. The irony wasn't lost on William that his brother had dedicated his professional life to studying the very royal history he was unknowingly part of. Through the window, they could see James frowning slightly as he made notes in red ink, completely absorbed in his work. William knocked gently on the classroom door. "Excuse me, Mr. Thompson? I'm sorry to disturb you after school hours." James looked up from his marking, and the moment their eyes met, something extraordinary happened. Both men froze, staring at each other with expressions of complete bewilderment. James's pen slipped from his fingers and clattered to the floor, while William felt his carefully prepared introduction disappear entirely from his mind. James started to speak, then stopped, his eyes scanning William's face with growing amazement. "This is going to sound completely mad, but you look exactly like—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Kate stepped forward, sensing that both men needed a moment to process what they were seeing. "Mr. Thompson, I'm Catherine, and this is my husband, William. We were wondering if we could speak with you about some historical research we're conducting. We believe there might be some interesting connections between your family history and some records we've been studying." James slowly stood up from behind his desk, never taking his eyes off William's face. "The resemblance is absolutely uncanny," he said, his voice filled with wonder rather than suspicion. "Has anyone ever told you that you look remarkably like—" He paused again, studying William's features more closely. "Well, like the Prince of Wales, actually, though I suppose that's a ridiculous thing to say." William felt his heart hammering in his chest. This moment was even more surreal than he had imagined it would be. "Actually, that's not as ridiculous as you might think," he said carefully. "That's rather related to why we're here." James invited them to sit in the student chairs arranged in a circle at the front of his classroom, the same setup he used for discussion-based lessons with his older students. The afternoon light filtering through the tall windows cast everything in a golden glow that seemed to make the moment feel both dreamlike and intensely real. "I have to tell you," James said, settling into his chair and continuing to study William's face with fascination. "I've always felt like something was incomplete, I suppose. Not unhappy. I have a wonderful life, a family I adore, work that fulfills me. But there's always been this sense that there was something missing, something I couldn't quite identify." Kate and William exchanged glances, both recognizing the significance of what James was describing without prompting. "Can you tell us about your childhood?" Kate asked gently. "What do you remember about your early years?" James leaned back in his chair, his expression growing thoughtful. "I was adopted when I was very young, 5 days old, according to my parents. They were incredibly loving, gave me every opportunity, never made me feel like anything other than their cherished son. But I've always been curious about my birth family, though I never pursued finding them because I didn't want to hurt my adoptive parents' feelings." He went on to describe growing up in a loving household where education was valued, where he had been encouraged to pursue his interests in history and literature, and where he had always felt secure and wanted. But he also spoke about strange dreams he had experienced throughout his life. Dreams of playing with another child who looked exactly like him, dreams of a woman with blonde hair and sad eyes who would read to him, dreams of grand rooms and formal gardens that felt familiar despite never having visited such places in his waking life. William listened to these descriptions with growing amazement. Many of the dreams James described matched his own memories of early childhood at various royal residences. The woman with blonde hair and sad eyes could only have been their mother, Diana, and the formal gardens sounded exactly like those at Kensington Palace and Windsor Castle. "There's something else," James continued, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "I've always had this strange connection to royal history, particularly to Princess Diana. Not in any obsessive way, but whenever I see photographs of her or documentaries about her life, I feel this overwhelming sense of sadness, like I'm grieving for someone I never met. My wife has always found it odd, especially since I'm not particularly interested in celebrity culture or royal gossip." The classroom fell silent as James finished speaking. Outside, they could hear the sounds of village life continuing. Children playing in the distance, cars passing on the narrow road, the everyday rhythms of a community going about its evening routine. But inside the classroom, 3 people sat surrounded by the weight of a secret that was about to change everything. William looked at Kate, seeing his own emotions reflected in her eyes. Wonder, sadness, hope, and fear all mixed together. The moment had come when he would have to decide whether to reveal the truth that would shatter James's understanding of his own identity, or to walk away and leave his brother to continue living in peaceful ignorance of his royal heritage. The weight of the moment pressed down on William like a physical force as he sat in the small classroom, looking at the man who shared not just his face, but apparently his dreams and inexplicable connections to their shared past. James Thompson sat waiting patiently for an explanation, his expression open and curious rather than suspicious. Despite the extraordinary circumstances of this unexpected visit, William reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small envelope containing one of the photographs from the Queen's secret collection, the image of 2 identical toddlers playing together, their faces bright with laughter. His hands trembled as he held it, knowing that showing this picture would irrevocably change James's life. "James," William began, his voice steady despite the emotional storm raging inside him. "What I'm about to share with you will sound impossible, but I need you to know that everything I'm going to tell you is absolutely true." He paused, looking directly into eyes that were mirror images of his own. "My full name is William Arthur Philip Lewis, and I am the Prince of Wales." James blinked several times, then let out a nervous laugh. "I'm sorry, but that's quite a claim to make. You certainly look like him, I'll grant you that, but—" Kate gently interrupted, pulling out her phone to show James official photographs of royal events, images that clearly showed William in his role as Prince of Wales. The resemblance was undeniable, and James's expression slowly shifted from skepticism to stunned recognition. "This is real," James whispered, staring at the phone screen, then back at William's face. "You're actually... But why are you here? In my classroom, in Millbrook? This doesn't make any sense." William held out the photograph, his heart breaking as he prepared to shatter the peaceful life of the brother he had never known he had. "Because 41 years ago, you and I were born on the same day, at the same time, to the same mother. James, you're my identical twin brother." The classroom fell into absolute silence. James stared at the photograph, his face cycling through expressions of disbelief, shock, and dawning recognition. In the image, 2 identical toddlers played together in what was clearly a royal nursery, surrounded by toys that spoke of privilege and luxury. "That's impossible," James said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. He continued staring at the photograph, his finger tracing the faces of the 2 children. "I was adopted. My parents told me. They said my birth mother was a young woman who couldn't care for a child, that it was a private adoption arranged through their solicitor." Kate leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "James, that's the story they were told to tell you. The truth is that you were born Prince James William Philip Louis on September 15, 1982. You were separated from William when you were 5 days old because of a minor physical condition that the royal advisors believed made you unsuitable as a potential heir to the throne." William pulled out copies of the medical records, birth certificates, and other documentation they had found in the Queen's study. As James examined each piece of evidence, his hands began to shake. The clubfoot mentioned in the medical records matched a condition he had been born with, something his adoptive parents had always said was just an unfortunate coincidence requiring surgery when he was young. Princess Diana was our mother, William continued, watching as James absorbed this earth-shattering revelation. She never stopped loving you, never stopped thinking about you. She had these paintings commissioned to preserve evidence of your existence, and she left me a letter expressing her hope that someday we would find each other. James stood up abruptly, pacing to the window and staring out at the peaceful village he had called home his entire conscious life. My dreams, he said quietly, his voice filled with wonder and pain. The woman with the sad eyes, the formal gardens, the feeling of loss I could never explain. Those weren't dreams at all, were they? They were memories, William confirmed. Early memories from before you were taken from the royal household. You were with us, with our mother, for 5 days. Even as an infant, you would have formed some impressions, some connections that your mind held on to even after you were separated from your birth family. The enormity of the situation was clearly overwhelming James. He turned back to face William and Kate, his expression a mixture of awe, anger, and profound sadness. Do you know what it's like, he said, his voice rising slightly, to spend your entire life feeling like a piece of you was missing, only to discover that the piece was your own brother, your own identity, your own family? William stood and approached James slowly, recognizing the pain in his brother's voice because he felt the same anguish. I've felt that same emptiness, he admitted. Growing up, I always had the sense that I was supposed to be part of a pair, that experiences should be shared with someone who understood them the way I did. I thought it was just the loneliness of royal life, but now I know it was the absence of my twin. James sank back into his chair, holding his head in his hands. My children, he said suddenly, looking up with alarm. What does this mean for them? They're the grandchildren of Princess Diana, the nephews and niece of the future King of England. Their entire understanding of who they are, where they come from, everything changes. Kate reached over and placed a comforting hand on James's shoulder. That's exactly why we wanted to find you, to talk to you before making any decisions about what to do with this information. Your privacy, your family's well-being, your right to choose how to handle this knowledge, all of that matters more than any royal protocol or public interest. William returned to his seat, leaning forward with intense sincerity. James, I want you to know that this doesn't have to change anything about your life unless you want it to. You have a beautiful family, a career you love, a community where you belong. The choice of what to do with this knowledge is entirely yours. James was quiet for a long time, processing everything he had learned. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I need to see my wife, talk to her about this. She deserves to know before anyone else. He looked at the photographs scattered on the desk between them. But first, I need to ask you something. Do you believe our mother would have wanted us to find each other? Without hesitation, William nodded. She left a letter specifically hoping for this day. She believed that the bond between twins couldn't be broken by distance or time, and she was right. We both felt that emptiness our entire lives. James picked up the photograph of them as toddlers, studying it with new understanding. I always wondered why I was drawn to teaching history, particularly royal history. Now I know I was trying to understand my own story without even realizing it. He looked up at William with tears in his eyes. What happens now? Now we take this one step at a time, Kate interjected gently. There's no rush, no pressure. We're here because we wanted you to know the truth, but how you choose to move forward is completely up to you. The afternoon was growing late, and James needed time to process the life-changing revelation. They agreed to meet again the following day, giving James the night to speak with his wife and begin to absorb the magnitude of what he had learned. As they prepared to leave the classroom, James suddenly reached out and embraced William, an instinctive gesture that felt completely natural despite them being strangers just hours earlier. Thank you, James said simply, for finding me, for telling me the truth, for giving me the choice of what to do with it. I always knew something was missing from my life, but I never imagined it was this extraordinary. As William and Kate drove away from the village school, Both of them felt emotionally drained, but oddly hopeful. They had taken the first step toward healing a wound that had existed for over 40 years, though they knew the journey ahead would be complex and potentially challenging for everyone involved. The next 24 hours would determine whether this reunion would remain a private family matter or become something that would reshape the public's understanding of the royal family. But for now, two brothers who had been separated at birth had found each other again, and that felt like the most important thing in the world. The next morning brought an unusually heavy fog to Millbrook Village, as if the very air itself was holding its breath for what was to come. William and Kate sat in their small cottage guest room at the local bed and breakfast, both having slept fitfully as they wondered how James had processed the earth-shattering revelations of the previous day. They had agreed to meet him at his home at 10 o'clock, giving him the morning to speak with his wife and children. At precisely 10 o'clock, they knocked on the door of Ivy Cottage, a charming stone house with climbing roses and a well-tended garden that spoke of the peaceful domestic life James had built for himself. The door opened to reveal not just James but a woman with kind eyes and graying hair, who could only be his wife Sarah. "Please come in," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the obvious emotional weight of the situation. "James has told me everything, and I have to say, even with all the evidence, it still feels like something from a fairy tale rather than real life." They were led into a cozy sitting room where two children, aged about 8 and 10, sat quietly on the sofa, their eyes wide with curiosity and confusion. James had clearly prepared them for this meeting. Though how do you explain to children that their father is the identical twin brother of the future King of England? "These are my children," James said, his voice filled with pride and protectiveness. "Emma and David. They know that you're their father's brother, and they're trying very hard to understand what that means." William knelt down to be at eye level with the children, his heart breaking as he looked at them. These were his nephew and niece, Diana's grandchildren, children who shared royal blood but had grown up in blessed normalcy. Emma, the older child, studied William's face with the same intensity her father had shown the day before. "You really do look exactly like Daddy," she observed seriously. "But your clothes are much fancier." The innocent observation broke some of the tension in the room, and everyone managed a small laugh. William realized that to these children he wasn't the Prince of Wales. He was simply the stranger who looked like their father and claimed to be his brother. Sarah served tea while James explained how the evening had unfolded after William and Kate's departure. He had come home and immediately told his wife everything, showing her the photographs and documents, watching as she struggled to process the impossible truth. They had then sat their children down and tried to explain, as simply as possible, that their father had just discovered he had a twin brother he had never known about. "The hardest part," Sarah said, looking directly at William, "is understanding why this had to be kept secret for so long. I know it was a different time, and royal traditions were more rigid, but James is the most wonderful man I've ever known. The idea that anyone could look at him as an infant and decide he wasn't worthy of his birthright because of a minor physical condition." She trailed off, her emotion evident. William nodded gravely. "I've struggled with that same anger since discovering the truth. The decision made when we were infants was wrong, based on outdated thinking and cruel prejudices. But I also have to live with the reality that if James had remained in the royal family, my entire life would have been different. I might never have met Kate, never had my children, never experienced the specific joys and challenges that have shaped who I am." James had been quiet during this exchange, but now he spoke up. "I've been thinking about that all night too. If I had grown up as a prince, I would never have become a teacher, never would have met Sarah, never would have had Emma and David. The life I've lived has been beautiful, filled with love and purpose and genuine happiness. I can't bring myself to regret it, even knowing what was taken from me." Kate watched the family dynamic with fascination and sadness. Here was a parallel version of what William's life might have looked like. Domestic, peaceful, grounded in everyday joys rather than royal duties and public scrutiny. She could see why James felt protective of the life he had built, even as he grappled with the magnitude of what he had been denied. "There's something else," James said, reaching for a small wooden box on the mantelpiece. After you left yesterday, I went up to the attic and looked through some old things my adoptive parents had saved from my early childhood. I found this, and it makes sense now in a way it never did before. Inside the box was a small silver rattle, clearly expensive and beautifully crafted, with engravings that included a crown and the initials WJPL, William James Philip Lewis. There was also a tiny hospital bracelet, so small it could only have fit an infant, with the same initials. My parents always said these came with me when they adopted me, but they never knew what the initials meant. The social worker told them they were probably family heirlooms from my birth mother, but couldn't provide any other details. William held the rattle, recognizing the craftsmanship as the same style as items from his own royal nursery. This small silver object represented the only tangible connection James had carried with him from his first 5 days of life, a link to his royal heritage that had been preserved even as everything else about his true identity was erased. The morning continued with James showing William and Kate through his home, sharing stories of his life, his work, his dreams for his children's futures. With every room they visited, every photograph they examined, every story James told, William felt both joy at discovering his brother's wonderful life and profound sadness for the decades they had lost. As they prepared to leave, young Emma approached William with a question that would stay with him forever. "Uncle William," she said, using the title with the casual ease of childhood, "if you're really a prince, does that make Daddy a prince too? And does that make me and David prince and princess?" The room fell silent as everyone waited for William's response. Technically, the answer was yes. James was indeed a prince by birth, and his children were legitimately members of the royal family, regardless of the circumstances of their father's adoption. But William also understood that acknowledging this truth publicly would change their lives forever. "Emma," William said carefully, kneeling down to her level again, "your daddy is one of the most royal people I've ever met, not because of who he was born to, but because of the kind, generous, loving man he's chosen to become. And that makes you and David more special than any title ever could." It was a diplomatic answer that preserved the family's right to choose their own future while honoring the love and character that had shaped their lives. As William and Kate finally left Ivy Cottage, all of them understood that they stood at a crossroads that would determine not just their own futures, but potentially the future of the British monarchy itself. The fog was beginning to lift as they walked back to their car, and for the first time since opening that door in Queen Elizabeth's study, William felt a sense of peace. He had found his brother, discovered a family filled with love and genuine happiness, and most importantly, had been given the opportunity to heal a wound that had existed for over 40 years. Whatever decisions lay ahead, whatever challenges they would face in determining how to handle this extraordinary secret, William knew that the most important thing had already been accomplished. Two brothers who had been torn apart by circumstance and royal protocol had found their way back to each other, and their mother's deepest wish had finally been fulfilled. The empty space that had existed in both their hearts for 4 decades was finally beginning to heal, filled with the joy of reunion and the promise of a future where they could be brothers at last.